Hello, Kim, and welcome back to our interview on your experiences with repressed memory. And we've spent 2 hours now talking about your background, your joining the Mormon Church, your having a history of trauma, which made you vulnerable and in needing therapy. And we've talked about your really unfortunate experiences with Rex Cokerhan's in Provo, where he crossed all sorts of boundaries, apparently by your report, and violated all sorts of ethical laws using hypnosis and recovered memory techniques. So you say at some point you and your husband stopped that therapeutic relationship with Rex. You said you had a baby, is that right?
That's right.
What I'm dying to know is how in the world could you then get back into therapy with Ruth Killpack where more hypnosis techniques are used after you had just been through a bunch of kind of abusive, inappropriate therapeutic techniques. So tell us how, and of course, for those who are tuning in now, this is significant and going to be interesting to the Mormon audience because, as we've already said, we're all familiar, or many of us are familiar with Martha Beck, national author, who made claims in her book, Leaving the Saints, that her father, Hugh Nibley, respected Mormon scholar and apologist by some. We all are aware of Martha Beck's claims that Hugh Nibley sexually abused her in the book that she came out with. There are many that jumped on and said, yes, Hugh Nibley's an abuser. There are others who came to Hugh Nibley's defense and said, no, these claims that Martha Beck made were made using these hypnosis and recovered memory techniques. And this man's being falsely accused, including members of Hugh Nibley's own family. And many of us are aware of Boyd Peterson, who wrote a book, a memoir of Hugh Nibley, and he, along with other daughters and maybe even sons of Hugh Nibley, condemned their sisters' accusations of sexual abuse, and again, saying it was recovered memory. Well, why am I bringing all this up? We are now about to talk about how Kim left Rex Cokerhan's as a therapist and went to Ruth Killpack as a therapist, who, it has been reported in Sunstone Magazine and other places, was also a therapist to Martha Beck. So, without any further ado, how in the world, Kim, did you end up with another practitioner of hypnosis and recovered memory?
Okay. If it would be okay, John, before we go into that, as you mentioned about Martha Beck and her family and her siblings not agreeing with what she was saying and not having any remembrance themselves of suffering those types of things with their father, Hugh Nibley, I wanted to touch on one thing with Rex Cokerhan's before we move on to my therapy with Ruth Killpack. And that was about when I called my mother and told my mother that I thought that this had happened to me. As I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, I have never told my dad that I went through any of this. And I did tell my mother. And so this was during therapy with Ruth. And if it's all right, I have just a couple paragraphs here about that. I decided to phone my mom and see if she could give me some information. I told her my dad had molested me as a child. I tried to conceal my own doubts for fear she wouldn't accept what Rex said about doubts being proof it had really happened. I wanted her to take me seriously, and I was afraid she wouldn't if she knew of my doubts. Her response was mildly hysterical. First, she denied my dad was capable of such a thing and told me that despite his faults, he never would hurt me like that. She was angry at Rex and accused him of incompetence and trying to fill his wallet at my expense. I maintained that my molestation had happened, but avoided going into any detail because I didn't know the details myself. I had kind of formulated a scenario based on my hypnotherapy experiences, but if pressed, I would be at a loss to offer any solid information. That's why I was calling her to try to get some information. She sounded confused. For a minute, her anger turned toward my dad, and she said if he really did that to me, she would buy a gun and shoot him. Then her anger was directed toward Rex again, and she defended my dad. She was torn by her doubts about the accusation and her trust in me. I felt obliged to defend Rex, and I felt a familiar angry frustration with my mom. Rex and I interpreted her angry and jumbled response as further proof the incest had occurred. I had become competent at filtering my past, my thoughts, and my feelings through repressed memory theories. No wonder I hadn't told her about the abuse when I was a kid. Look at how she responded now. She would have blamed me. Or maybe I had told her and she did blame me. I'd have to think about it and see which explanation felt right and try to do self-hypnosis to remember. She was most likely a sexual abuse victim herself and was in denial. Before she could acknowledge my abuse, she'd first have to unrepress her own. It was common, I was taught, for sexually abused women to marry sexually abusive men. During later phone calls, I asked her questions about her own childhood, looking for evidence that she too had been sexually abused.
Couple just quick responses. Thank you for sharing that. And again, there's some of you that don't like on Mormon Stories to hear things being read. I'll just repeat what we've said in the past. Kim wanted to read because during and after immediately the time that she experienced these things, she wrote down her memories and impressions. And any good historian will know that anything that's written down, the sooner it is to the event that actually happened, the more accurate it's likely to be because of how flawed memory can be. So thank you for your patience as we allow Kim to read these things, because it's her attempt and our attempt to be as accurate as possible when we talk about this. But when you talk about, confronting your dad through your mom, that's so sensitive because, of course, isn't it just classic in abuse scenarios where real perpetrators are defended and protected by the other spouse, right? Or by the church or by siblings. So just the fact that, your mom in this case wanted to defend your dad doesn't mean that it's true or false that there was abuse. That's a classic response to anyone accused of abuse, whether they're guilty or not, right? So that makes it complicated, right? But then, as you read that, I'm just thinking, there that fishing is again. Not only has now your therapist, projected onto you, Rex Cochran's has projected onto you all this sexual abuse that he's seeing everywhere. It's like to anyone who has a hammer, everything is a nail, right? He's projected that onto you through hypnosis and suggestions. And now you're trying to project that onto your mom, right? And everyone else. And that's how this spreads, right? It becomes this social panic where everybody is seeing it everywhere and projecting it onto everybody. And it reminds me of the McCarthy hearings with the communist accusations. Everyone's a communist. You're a communist. She's a communist. I'm a communist. And it reminds me of the Salem witch trials where she's a witch and he's a witch. And if you defend the witch, you must be in witchcraft. That's the sign of these social panics where it just becomes this virus where it's getting projected onto everybody. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, that's right. And I appreciate you with the way that you're approaching these subjects, because I'm not here to say that there is no such thing as repressed memories. As I explained in our first part of visiting, I believe that I have had forgotten or repressed memories, but
we all forget things all the time.
But just not of sexual abuse by my dad.
Yeah.
That was very different. And so as I also in the first part of our discussion, I mentioned sexually abusive experiences that I had unrelated to repressed memories in childhood and as a young adult. And my heart goes out to people who have suffered sexual abuse. What I suffered was something of, I would say it like this. I suffered the pain of not knowing who my dad was for a time and thinking he could be a sexual predator for a time. And in the course of that, I suffered in ways that people who really have been sexually abused suffer.
Right. So tell us how in the world you ended up with another therapist that practiced hypnosis and recovered memory after you booted Rex Cokerhans as your therapist.
I don't think you mess around with somebody's mind like mine was messed around with, and you just walk away.
Right.
You say, okay, this guy, he wasn't behaving professionally, so the whole thing is a farce, and I'm just going to walk away now.
You were maybe more messed up than before.
I was more messed up than I had ever been in my life.
So the therapy was damaging you.
It damaged me. I was having more trouble functioning than I ever had in my life,
right,
despite all of the trauma that I talked about in our first discussion. So I was scared, and I also still felt responsible for any potential victims of my alleged perpetrator dad. I felt a responsibility, unlike Rex, who was able to recklessly talk about reporting my dad based on so little evidence. I felt a great responsibility to protect people. And I was concerned, what if my dad is hurting a little child in his life? And so I thought, okay, Rex might be inappropriate, but I better see somebody else. And so my bishop at the time, now it's a different bishop, I've moved. The bishop at the time, he goes to LDS Social Services and he asks for a recommendation. And Ruth Killpack is the name that he was given, and he shared with me. Of note, when all of this, when I finally woke up and I left 4 years of this nightmare, the same bishop went back to the LDS social service person, I believe it was the director of a particular location, and told him about what my experience was, and that man was horrified. He said he had no idea that Ruth Killpack was doing that type of therapy, and he would never have referred me to her if he had known that she was doing it. So I go to Ruth Killpack for individual therapy. As I mentioned before, she had undergraduate degree from BYU in family studies and a master's degree in family studies. And then she had a new doctorate in marriage and family therapy. She heard my experience. I told her my experience about what had happened with Rex, and she too was convinced that based on that hypnotherapy experience, that initial one and the following ones, and all of my emotion, she too was convinced that I had repressed memories of being sexually abused by my dad, even though I never had ever thought such a thing. I never had suspected such a thing. I never had any memory before my first therapist, Rex Cokerhans, insisted that this had happened to me. So I shared with her also stories of my experience with Rex as far as the boundary violations. And she listened to those and she said something interesting. She said, you're not the first person who has had stories like this about Rex that they have shared with me. And she told me that Rex had recreated the incestuous relationship that I'd had with my dad by isolating me and using me to satisfy his own emotional needs. That's when she gave me the phone number for Doppel and suggested that I call Doppel and report him. And I've already talked about what happened with that in the first episode, where they didn't think there was enough to investigate him. Ruth and we discussed these boundary violations and tossed around the idea that maybe Rex was the problem, why I wasn't remembering sexual abuse by my dad, that maybe Rex's boundary violations had made me scared so that I couldn't come out of denial and remember that I had been abused in that way. But she was sure that I had repressed incest memories. In fact, I questioned her so many times about the trauma that I had experienced as a child and as a young adult, that I go over in the first discussion with John. So many times I ran through the list with her again, asking her, are you sure that my symptoms are not from this? And she had a pet phrase she liked to use. She used to put two of her fingers together and point at me, and she'd say, trust me, it happened.
And that's, again, a therapist leading with their bias, wanting to see it everywhere, like to someone with a hammer, everything's a nail. And it's so inappropriate for a therapist to tell you what happened and to insist in such a forceful way. And so it's outrageous that was your second experience in therapy. It's terrible. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in the therapy with Ruth, I had made a note in my writing that the individual therapy, this was back in the early 90s, it was $70 for 50 minutes of therapy with her. My insurance would cover part of this. I also noticed that when I would show up for therapy, I had to write on a paper by the front desk where the receptionist was. There was a list of clients, and then you had to check, kind of like when you go to the doctor, check your method of payment. I saw so many in the list that said bishop, bishop, bishop. So many of the women, their therapy was being funded, either for individual or group therapy or both, was being funded by their bishops. I have to ask myself how many of them, like my bishop, knew what was going on in the therapy, and if they would have supported what was going on. My bishop did not pay for, not him, but him as a representative. He did not give money for any of my therapy. But in therapy with Ruth, aside from hypnotherapy and then me doing self-hypnosis at home, other suggestive techniques were used. These techniques, I don't know that in and of themselves that all of them pose the same risk or can be considered so highly suggestive. It's more to me about the way that they're done, with the agenda, with the discounting the client's own experience and going with the therapist's idea of what is supposed to be true. But with that in mind, aside from the hypnotherapy and self-hypnosis, she did therapy with me with anatomically correct dolls, with free association, with analyzing body memories, and with making up a story. Making up a story, that's when if you feel some painful emotion and you can associate it with anything in your past. Say, for instance, you're feeling scared when you drive down the freeway, and you can think back and you can remember, oh, you know what? One time when I was a kid, I witnessed an auto accident, and you can make that connection. Well, if a person was unable to make any kind of a connection, then Ruth would say, make up a story. and you just off the top of your head start talking. And of course, it was in the context of remembering sexual abuse. And so that was another method.
And just to be clear, and you mentioned puppets. We talked about in the last episode, with the expert, the emergence in the early 80s of the social worker named Key McFarland, who was a social worker, claiming to be an expert on child protection, who was investigating the McMartin daycare preschool scandal in California. And as she emerged, it says in this book, Evil Carnate, Rumors of Demonic Conspiracy and Satanic Abuse in History, that Key McFarland developed these techniques, a way of interviewing children suspected of abuse using hand puppets, dolls, and playful interview techniques. And then when you talk about your therapist actually having you write the equivalent of fiction in your therapy session, in the context of also retrieving and then restoring memories, that idea of having you create fictional narrative and interweaving it with, again, the retrieval and the storing of your memories, that is creating memories. I mean, isn't it? Or at least that's how it would seem.
It definitely had an effect on me, but anything memory-like for me did not have an authentic feeling to it.
Right.
I consider myself an intelligent, analytical type of person. I was analyzing this as I was going along. Of course, I was limited. I had limited life experience. Started this just when I was around 23, and it went until I was about 27. So I had limited experience, and I still was in a place in my mind where I had this idea about what was written in books and authority, that it was facts. I didn't yet have the maturity to appreciate the need for critical thinking when you're working with authority.
And also, again, you're working with a therapist that was referred to you by your bishop.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's some ecclesiastical pressure, some spiritual, patriarchal pressure.
Well, that brings up another point, and that is that Ruth was the widow of a bishop, and that she went into this field after she was widowed in middle age, and she had children to take care of, and it was like a new life for her. She was getting into this.
And who is this again, Ruth?
Ruth Killpack.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Also, there was journaling, and as far as putting this into my mind, writing down experiences of hypnotherapy and self-hypnosis, writing it down, that would reinforce it too. I bounced back and forth throughout 4 years of thinking, leaning toward, this really happened to me, and then saying, this did not happen to me. This does not real. Sometimes this happened in the same day, the bouncing back and forth. I was eager to be successful, to remember, because that was the goal that was set up for me, and I wanted to please.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And clients should never want to please their therapist, by the way. That's not your job. Mm-hmm. It's not your job to please your therapist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I know reading might not be ideal, but I really have to read something related to that, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
Let me find it here. This can say, I think, better than I can express just right now. I think that this is a very helpful in understanding the kind of pressure that was put on me by Rex Coker-Hans and Ruth Killpack to remember things. The moral pressure that was was put on, and the pressure to please, since that was already a problem I had before I started therapies. In group therapy, I had listened intently as Ruth explained her philosophy about therapy. She said the whole therapist-client relationship was about trust. She said the therapist asks her client to take risks. She compared this to being told to jump off a cliff, saying the client may feel the risks are life-threatening, literally like being told to jump off the edge of a cliff, a mental cliff. All her instincts may tell the client not to jump. However, only if she trusts the therapist that all will be well and jumps will she heal. She also had added that those clients who were willing to trust her the most were the ones who healed the fastest and ended therapy the quickest. And I was upset. I had jumped off the cliff so many times, I had lost count, and rather than feeling healed, I felt like my sense of well-being lay smashed in the ravine below the cliff. Was I ever going to be happy? Was I ever going to come out of denial? Other women supposedly had done it. What was wrong with me?
Right. And so, so go ahead and that idea, it sounds like what Ruth is trying to do there is have you shut off your own internal skepticism, your own internal boundaries, your own internal sense for what's good for you,
and that
completely submit to.
It's completely submit, and that was the last thing that I needed. My life up to this therapy, my life had disempowered me. I was afraid of myself.
Right.
I felt inadequate. I felt like a failure. I was scared. I was lonely. I needed to be empowered to trust myself.
Not told to trust your therapist and
That's
to
right.
deny and ignore your own internal compass.
That's right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Another thing with the therapy was a book and a workbook called The Courage to Heal. This was written by two women who had no degree in any mental health field. And it talked about recovering repressed memories. This workbook I had, and I read it all the time. And in this workbook, it talked about all kinds of goofy things. Like, for instance, one time when I was in therapy with Ruth, I had on glasses, and Ruth turned to me quickly, and out of the blue she said, "What did you want to see that you had to start wearing glasses?" Meaning, what happened in childhood that you had to start wearing glasses? It had a lot of suspicious type of therapy techniques, which were developed in great measure by these women who had no education to be able to exercise this kind of authority that someone with a PhD is going to be relying on, somebody without any education in mental health,
Right.
to direct their therapy.
Right.
Okay. So there was a lot of pressure, manipulation, abusive therapy, and more suffering for me and my family. At Ruth's suggestion, I got involved with her group. She also did group therapy, along with teaching assertiveness classes that she was always marketing. And with the group therapy, it was for 8 women, and women would come and go. It was $20 to attend the group or have a bishop pay for it. And in the group, women would process their abuse experiences. All of the women in the group had had some type of child abuse experience. The majority, it was sexual abuse. Most of the women were like me, with no memory of any history of sexual abuse, but they had uncovered repressed memories through therapy. There was a big difference between those women who had the repressed memories and those women who had never forgotten. And it was incredibly painful to listen to the stories of the women who had never forgotten that it had happened with them. And they were in a different place. Those women, they were hoping to heal, whereas for those of us repressed memories, almost like all of our energy, even though the end goal was to heal, almost all of it was about to remember. The focus was on to remember. Sometimes I worked with Ruth in group or in individual therapy on issues not related to sexual abuse. I did cover other traumas I had with her. She still was convinced I had been sexually abused by my dad. In the group, those therapeutic methods that I've already talked about were used. There also was a strange thing that those of us with the repressed memories, we used to talk sometimes after group or during breaks and compare notes, and we were so much in the same place with being so confused but trusting like that. And we felt the desire to be happy and had bought into the idea that this was the way that it was going to happen for us. Some of us took note that Ruth did something odd about alleged perpetrators. So if a woman talked about, say, she had a repressed memory, and she talked about the abuser, alleged abuser, or even if it wasn't about sexual abuse, in any scenario where a woman was saying something had happened to her, Ruth would attack the alleged perpetrator. She showed no mercy in her tone or how she would respond. There was no, I would say, trying to take a mature approach to something that a woman might be talking about, like maybe your husband, we don't want to make excuses for him, but in reality, with you going through this repressed memory therapy and you not wanting to have sex for years, maybe your husband has his own needs, and maybe no, there was no mercy for anyone that a woman said was hurting her or affecting her in some way. And a very dramatic thing would take place. I don't know if this is still used in therapy settings or not, but Ruth had these padded bats or padded clubs, batakas, something like that. Mm-hmm. And say that I had say in group therapy that I had a repressed memory that came out. And even though it doesn't feel real and it feels like just a story, Ruth would say, okay, now I want you to go and sit in this special chair, and I'm going to put a chair across from you and keep it empty. I want you to pretend that the alleged perpetrator is in that empty chair, and I want you to talk to that alleged perpetrator and tell them how you're feeling about what they did and what they did to you. And then she would have that client move into the empty chair and pretend to be the perpetrator and talk about what they think and how they would respond, use their imagination like that. And then she'd give us one of these padded clubs and encourage us to pound the hell out of the empty chair and to yell and scream and pound the hell out of it. And I would do that, and other women did that. And then afterwards, like I can picture some of these group members with me, a woman would look so exhausted and so like embarrassed about what she had done. And then Ruth would say, okay, now let's give her a reality check. And everybody would go around the room of the group members and commend the client. Commend, oh, you're so brave, you're being so courageous, we're so proud of you, way to go. So whether the woman believed what had happened in that scenario or not, she was commended by Ruth and the whole group for being a hero. That woman, so not only was the therapist doing the repressed memory therapy a hero, but the women, like myself, were made out like they were heroes.
And what that seems to introduce for me is this strong, powerful social positive reinforcement that people are being sort of pushed and egged on and nurtured towards believing and believing these recovered memory claims and owning that created or manufactured story and almost like being celebrated to embrace and celebrate their victimhood, right?
It was a new identity.
A new identity of a victim.
And you weren't alone, and I wasn't alone anymore. Now I had a whole group that were saying, it's true, believe it, like that.
And what does that do to you in your attempt to try and decide if this stuff really happened? If you've got all your therapists and all these people celebrating you and applauding you as you're beating your fictitious victor with a bat, what does that do in your own internal desire to try and make sense of what actually really did happen?
It could go, and it did. It went either way for me. Sometimes, like one time, the supposed memory, repressed memory, was so outrageous. It so like impossible, just so against common sense. There was just no way. And so at times like that, it's like, what's going on here? This is weird. What's going on here? Some of the women would uncover repressed memories of ritual abuse. And
like satanic ritual abuse?
I'm particularly remembering ritual abuse.
Okay.
And it's like, because I was still LDS and I'm hearing about this kind of stuff, and it's
like temple ceremony stuff, or
yes,
so and you hear about this, that there are Mormons along the Wasatch Front who intermingle ritual sexual abuse with temple ceremony rituals. And I'm not, again, saying whether that does or doesn't happen, but that's another flavor of the ritual abuse. It's not satanic. It's actually Mormon temple ceremony. And Pace even mentions this, the incorporation of Mormon temple ceremony-like things into the ritual abuse. Yeah.
And as I had mentioned, Ruth was the widow of a bishop, but we knew that she wasn't what is now called Orthodox. Like one time, in group, another woman called Ruth out on this thing about attacking alleged perpetrators or attacking husbands or, whatever. She called her out on that, and she said, Ruth, that doesn't seem like very Christian-like, that no mercy, that no trying to understand, no empathy kind of approach. And Ruth got angry, and she said, I'll tell you right now, you can get more of Christianity in therapy with me than you can at church.
Right. Mm-hmm. A lot of power She felt a lot of power. And this is Ruth Killpack.
That's right.
Okay. So you were going to say it could go two ways, though. So on the one hand, some of these, the crowd cheering you on, sometimes if the stories are too fantastic, it could make you wonder about their truthfulness. Could it have the opposite effect as well?
Yeah, the opposite effect of validating things that for myself, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm so confused. I don't know what happened to me. How am I ever going to know? I can't remember anything. And then having the women saying, "Oh no, yeah, it happened. It happened like that." One interesting thing that happened, among many interesting things, is that one woman in my group, she approached me and she said, I have such a hard time believing my memories, but when I see you in group unrepressing your memories, then I think, man, mine must be true.
Yeah.
With the therapy with Ruth, I don't know if we're ready to get to the part when I leave it. I think there was some other stuff I wanted to tell you about before that, but
no, you can. Whatever.
Okay. While I'm thinking about it, let me go ahead and address it. This therapy, like I have said, it was going on and on and on, and there was so much suffering, and my marriage suffered, and I was doing my best to be a good and attentive mother. That was so important to me. I love my children, and trying to cope and then not knowing how to talk to my dad. Sometimes I'd be like passive aggressive on the phone with him because I didn't know how to deal with this. And I wanted this to come to an end. And so I went to Ruth for the last time, and I went through my list of the traumas I had experienced in my life unrelated to incest, and asked her again, "Are you sure?" And she, again, "Trust me, it happened." And then I said, "What will happen if I never remember? What will happen to me? What will happen if I leave therapy?" And she said, "It'll follow you. It'll follow you. You aren't going to be free from it. It will follow you, and when you're strong enough, you will remember." And I heard that, and I said to myself, I'm going to remember. I've put all this time into this. I've suffered so much. I'm going to remember. And so at that time, I had just started seeing her for group, and I had not been seeing her for individual. I decided I'm going to do both, and I'm going to give it 100%. And so I met with her for group, and with this huge pressure I had on myself to remember, based on what she had told me about the consequences if I didn't, I started having dramatic, crazy, unrepressed memories in hypnosis. Before I knew it, I had a memory that a female relative had abused me, but it followed the same path as it had with incest from my dad, that it felt horrible, had bits and pieces of remembrances unrelated to sexual abuse and objects, and with my mind trying to string it all together, only to have that experience and then to say, this just does not feel real. It moved to 3 male relatives, either through hypnosis with Ruth or self-hypnosis of 3 male relatives sexually abused me. And then in group therapy, that I had been raped. And with that rape experience, there was a woman in the group who actually had experienced a rape, and she helped me get home. I was so upset after this experience, and I said to myself after this experience, if all of this This has happened to me. I must surely be out of my mind. I must be just a walking zombie. I am a walking zombie. How could anyone have experienced all that I remember experiencing, plus repressed incest, repressed sexual abuse by a female relative, repressed sexual abuse by 3 male relatives, and a rape, and be able to even survive in life? And I went home and I told my husband about this rape, but as I was telling him, my mind was saying to me, I don't feel like somebody who's been raped. This does not feel real. This feels like I put pieces together to try to make a story out of these fragments of things. And then I made a decision. Okay, maybe enough. This was very expensive too. This was really expensive and time consuming, and I was falling apart. And I said, enough already. I have to take my chances. Enough. And my bishop had come over. He was part of the stimulus in this, the same one who had got the referral for Ruth Killpack in the first place. My husband had asked him to come over, and he sat with me, and my husband had told him about now this rape, supposed rape. And this bishop said to me, Kim, I don't know what happened to you, but you're falling apart. This isn't working for you. I think you need to try something different like that. And I felt a relief when he said that, like I was having permission. I could quit this. But no sooner did he walk out the door than I felt so angry at him. I had been taught that if somebody challenges my therapy, they don't give a damn about me as a human being. It's just self-serving, and I should avoid them at all cost. They're bad influence. So I was mad at him, and I went to see Ruth, and I told Ruth about it, and she was mad at him, and she said, what right does he have to say that to you? What right does he have to say that to you? But nevertheless, I had had enough, and I decided I'm going to stop this. Then something really amazing happened. A couple of weeks after I made that decision, I opened up our front door, and there was a newspaper, rubber band around it, on the front porch. And we didn't subscribe to the newspaper. And I brought that in, and the cover story on the newspaper was about false memory syndrome and repressed memories. And I read through that, and it was just like as fast as I had joined the Mormon church, as I talked about initially, it was like a finger snap of awakening. This is what happened to me. There was nothing that aside from my mom questioning the motives of Rex, there really wasn't anyone in my life who had questioned repressed memories. It wasn't like we could Google things and stuff. It wasn't in that time. There was no one who had. This was the first in 4 years, aside from my mom, who questioned it. And I knew immediately that this is what I was going through. This is what had happened to me.
And just 2 quick things, just to reflect on the ending part of that story with Ruth Killpack. 2 things you mentioned. If they're persistent enough in the therapists and the groups in encouraging you to create or recover falsely memories, you experienced ultimately this burst in memories. Again, the other women and the rape and all that. That just shows that is the outcome. If you do it long enough, even if you're resisting, even if you're unsure, you do that quote treatment long enough, you're going to experience this burst of accusations. But also it was great. It was sad that your bishop put you on to Ruth Killpack. It's great that your bishop had the sense to say this isn't helping you, because this is damaging people. But then the final thing is, you said you experienced that immediate resentment towards the bishop for telling you to stop your therapy, because these therapists prime you to target as enemies anyone who shows any skepticism or uncertainty about the treatment you're experiencing. And this is when families get ripped apart. They get ripped apart when your therapist primes you to make anyone an enemy who dares ever question the therapist's approach or the memories that get manufactured in this scenario.
In my therapy, in the group, at one time, there was some talk about some woman who had left the group and didn't want to pursue repressed memories anymore. And she was vilified. And she was talked about as being inferior to the rest of the group members.
Right. And as we listened to in that interview on Radio West, A Short Panic and a Life Cut Short with Doug Fabrizio and Alice Talmadge, who wrote a book called Now I Can See the Moon, a story of the social panic, false memories, and a life cut short, which is a story about satanic ritual abuse, recovered memory and claims of satanic ritual abuse happening in both Logan and in Provo, Orem, ironically. They talked about how journalists who, during the time, again, showed any skepticism or questioned these, SRA rumors or accounts, the journalists were vilified and in some cases run out of the business or demonized for showing any skepticism, even though years later, just like with the McCarthy hearings, just like with the Salem witch trials, many of these journalists were vindicated because these were false accusations levied against people in reaction to a social panic.
I think that, unfortunately, we see this a lot in our society related to this type of topic and other topics. Excuse me. Let me take a drink. You have issues which are very, very complex in life. There is so much uncertainty in life. And then you have people who feel so strongly that their view of an issue is the one true view. And it's almost like they're ready to die for the issue, even though it's so emotional, and the closing off of taking in other information to really try to make a critical judgment about an issue. I think we see that all over our society, just jumping in, not wanting to hear the other side, and then having this certain type of, it is an arrogance and it is a naivete to take something so complex and to think that one really could ever fully understand it and not need to research and get other opinions and keep a somewhat open mind about the issue instead of vilifying people who think differently.
It's tricky. It's so tricky because it's so emotional. All these things are so emotional, right?
Mm-hmm. And so often we don't understand our own motivations for why we do the things that we do, or what we get out of having certain beliefs.
But also not, legitimate victims are so often ignored or not believed or told to stay silent, or, the perpetrators protected. And, things unreported, or even if they're reported, they don't lead to convictions. And so that's what makes this so hard, is that, yes, you want to keep an open mind. Yes, you want to look at all sides. But you also don't want to just say that victims shouldn't be believed at all.
That's right. And unfortunately, sometimes people, advocates for different causes, they swear allegiance to the cause and jump on the bandwagon for a cause, and in the name of the cause, they let go of some of their moral reasoning.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
You know, what kind of a therapist would feel comfortable encouraging someone like me to report their dad to the social services or to the police? What is that about? How can someone let go of? To me, that's so obvious that how hurtful that could be based on no evidence.
Right. Yeah. And again, that's what makes all this so frustrating and hard, is that in 2019, what we're caring about is, people like Joseph Bishop, allegedly raping a female sister missionary in the basement of the Provo MTC, which we have him on audio recording it at least once and I think twice with the Provo police, admitting that he did things like that, and again, Sterling Von Wagner admitting to Sean Escobar that he had sexually fondled him as a boy. And yet we have the church, and we have the whole spotlight thing with the Catholic Church and peace and priests and pedophiles and children being abused. But when there are these questionable techniques that are being used, that can be a cover for institutions to sort of say, oh, any accusation made against us, it's all that recovered memory business, it's all that crazy satanic ritual abuse business. And it allows these false accusations, this hysteria stuff, allows institutions to protect itself and dismiss credible accusations and accounts, as they can just conveniently merge it all together and then dismiss credible accounts. And that's, again, what makes this so frustrating, right?
Yeah, it is. And it is very complicated. And I think that there are some things in place now that can help prevent this from happening in therapy now, like the emphasis, as you were mentioning, the education that you received, empowering, not having your own agenda, going where the client wants to go. How did I go through 3.5 years of therapy in a 4-year period where I was falling apart instead of getting better, and the therapist never made note of that it wasn't working for me? I hope that therapists are better prepared.
Right. Mm-hmm. So if you're ready, when you ended things, if you're able to talk about ending things with Ruth Killpack, did you like have a conversation with her? Did you tell her you didn't like what she was doing? Did you just quit? Mm-hmm. How did that end?
I told her, I worded it that I was going to take a break.
Mm-hmm. And were you scared to tell her that? With the power differential?
I anticipated rejection, but I was so exhausted.
You were done.
I was done. And
did she get mad at you or fuss at you, or? She
seemed kind of relieved. And why? I'm not sure, but I do know that a woman had entered our group who had seen Rex Cokerhans for therapy, and this woman was talking about that she liked him so much and positive things about him. And after that woman had talked about Rex, Ruth, after the group therapy, had pulled me aside and said, I know you heard, about that, and probably better not to talk about Rex, in this setting, like in the group setting and that. And at the time, my mind had said to me, she doesn't want to take responsibility for what she knows about Rex. She doesn't want to take responsibility for the things that she told me about Rex with this woman, because this woman, she's got to validate this woman. And
Okay.
like that. So I had a sense of like, maybe she was ready to move on to a new client. She had a waiting list. There was a waiting list for individual therapy. There was a waiting list for group therapy. Maybe she was ready to move on to somebody who was going to stop questioning things. I have to ask myself why I never got to that point where, even though it was so long, why I never got to that point of accepting what they were pressuring me to, what might make me different. Of course, leaving the door open that it is possible to have repressed memories. But as I mentioned earlier, the American Psychological Association says that to totally repress so that you're not even aware that you were ever abused is quite rare.
Yeah, and I read the statement, and the APA basically says most people, if they were sexually abused, remember, so at least some or all, that it's rare, very rare, for someone who is sexually abused to not remember any of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, unless they're a baby. You know what I mean?
So there was something about my personality, my background. My parents are both very independent thinkers. Something maybe about that. Something about my sense of right and wrong, and about how I didn't want to take a chance on hurting anybody unless I was sure, unless I had some confidence that it had really happened.
Right.
If it was those things.
Right. So tell us how you moved from leaving the care of Ruth of Ruth Killpack to actually becoming kind of a public opponent of recovered memory, or reparative memory, or
Yeah, with the public advocate. I had to do it very carefully because I was still wanting to protect my family. And I did things using different names, like I'm doing this now. And in that newspaper article that I mentioned, I went to visit with that reporter. That was one of those, I think they're called, like Utah County had one. I was living in Orem, and Utah County had one, and it covered Utah County news. I went to visit with the reporter who wrote that article, and I got more information from him. And that article mentioned the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was, well, it came together. There were parents and others, professionals and people who knew the parents, who were suffering by being accused of having sexually abused adult children when they were little. And they became a resource for me, and were very interested in what I had to say, of course. And one of the families, so there was a local meetup of False Memory Syndrome Foundation in Utah, and I went to that meetup shortly after I got this newspaper article. And I visited with parents of a daughter who had seen Rex Cokerhans. And they told me about their daughter's experience and how uncertain she was of her memories. And that she said that she used to watch a soap opera sometimes before she had therapy. And that in hypnosis, the things she was remembering were things she saw in the soap opera, as far as sexual type environments like that. And interesting with this family, the father had an extramarital affair. And they were so surprised when I was telling them about some of the trauma I had been through and asking them if their daughter had been through trauma like that. And the couple had told me the father had an affair, and that they hadn't made the connection, that maybe that had done something to disrupt the sense of connection between the daughter. When I learned that my parents had affairs, I felt so rejected, and I felt angry and resentful and scared, and that maybe that creates an opening to contemplate if maybe your parent is possible of it. No one would want to think that their parent would do that, even though as an adult you understand how that can happen. So with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, they provided me with resources, and I gave them permission to share my name with reporters, and so I did some interviews. I was interviewed by Deseret News using a different name, talking about my experience in other places. I started to notice something as I was participating with the media, and this was really eye-opening for me. I had an experience with television where I had opportunity through the False Memory Syndrome Foundation to go on a TV program, a talk show. I was on the show with a family, a mother and a father, and a teenage son, where the daughter had gone through therapy and had accused the father, and then also with a couple whose daughter had therapy and had accused them. And we went on the program, and I knew from when we went in the green room and the host of the program came into the room to introduce themselves, I knew that something was wrong. I had been really wined and dined by the producer of the program, and I think that she had some sincerity to her. She said they really wanted to expose about repressed memories and what could go wrong with this type of therapy and that. And but when I was in the green room and met the host, as I'm saying, the way that person treated the family members and myself, very hostile toward us. And then when we were on the program, I remember the parents and we were looking at each other and saying, wow, what's going on? And then the program started, and it became clear this was not any kind of interest in understanding anything better, understanding our experiences, shedding light on another side to what's going on. This was about trying to make us look like fools. And it was so sensationalized, and a supposed therapist who was some type of a New Age type of therapist was planted in the audience, and just out of nowhere, the camera turns to this person, and this person starts arguing against my take on my experience and what these parents are saying, and basically promoting that that I've been deceived, and that these parents and that brother, that they're guilty as all get out, and like I'm a pawn in this whole thing. And I had gone in disguise for this. The show had put a disguise on me, but that was a joke too. I think it was designed to make me look like a fool. And when I came off the show and went back to the makeup room and they took off the wig and all of that, I could not stop crying. I was crying so hard and for so long, I had been traumatized because I was still freshly out of this, and I wasn't up for the vilification. I was hoping for support. I wanted understanding and support, but I didn't get it. And then I had a reporter from the Boston Globe call me, and she wanted to interview me over the phone about my experience. But talking with my husband, we had decided that I had to really be careful. I had been in one obsession, and there was so much demand for me to talk about my experience that if I wasn't careful, I was never going to get over what I had been through, and I was going to just move from one obsession into something else. And so we made a decision together. I'll do so much advocacy work, and then it's time to really try to heal, try to, like that. And the reporter from the Boston Globe, I told her that, and I told her it from the heart, still somewhat naive, told her it from the heart, and she accused me of, she vilified me. She said, if you really had this experience, if you had really had these awful things, if it's true, then you would want to talk to me. So have to be careful with the media, because maybe they're looking for people who want to be heroes, and people who they can get to validate their prejudged assessment of issues, rather than to learn more about something or get at any kind of truth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like triple. You have all the trauma of your childhood, then you have the trauma that your therapists inflict upon you, multiple therapists, then you have the trauma of the media of trying to be an advocate. And that's just awful. I'm so sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I'm just going to keep coming back to this. Like, I really want to interview people who claim to have experienced satanic ritual abuse. And I have to imagine that now that I've brought on, you, and then, formerly Dr. David Frankfurter, both are who are explicitly speaking to the elements associated with reports of satanic ritual abuse that are problematic, like the hypnosis, like the recovered memory, like the social panic element, like the long 2 millennia history of claims around sacrificing babies and eating babies. And I'm worried that people who really are legitimate victims are going to say, well, this isn't a safe environment to tell my story. I don't want to victimize them by, number one, all the recordings that we've already done, but also I don't want to bring them on and feel like I'm interrogating them and not believing them. And that's part of what makes this so complicated.
That's right. I think we have to be so cautious and not just have a broad brush and say, oh, any forgotten memories that are remembered, those are a joke. You can't believe those.
Right.
Or to say that anything that pops into your head through suggestive therapy techniques, you have to believe that those are real. A point I really want to strongly make is that I was aware when I was doing hypnotherapy and self-hypnosis of my mind trying to weave these details into the goal of remembering sexual abuse. And that when I have remembered things, traumatic things unrelated to sexual abuse, things that I had forgotten, what have you, they came with a power that there was no question in my mind that it had happened. If I'm unique in that, I don't know. I don't think anybody could tell us at this point if it's something unique, or if all people who enter therapy and do any kind of thing to try to get at things from the past, if this is something they could be careful about. When I have done EMDR, I have seen that I could so easily break into doing that again, taking something that feels real and making up a story in my mind with the intent of piecing all these things together into this scene with all the emotion that comes with it. So I think EMDR is a very powerful therapeutic tool, but it shouldn't be entered in to unless that therapist has a lot of experience with it and does nothing to pressure their client to follow that therapist's agenda, and that therapist doesn't, based on something that is remembered or thought to be a remembrance, that therapist doesn't put that stamp of approval on it. This happened to you. I can tell you, you want to be remembering this unless this really happened to you. Therapists have to be really careful.
Right. Yeah. And I'll just say from my PhD, EMDR was actually selected or validated as an empirically supported treatment for PTSD in certain scenarios, and it's used by the Department of Defense to help treat soldiers with PTSD. Now, that doesn't mean we understand how it works totally or why it works, and there are some CBT therapists that aren't big fans of EMDR. At the same time, more and more as the field of psychology has matured, like you said, coming out of the 90s and 2000s, there became this really strong emphasis on empirically supported treatments instead of more of the hokey, folk magic, unsubstantiated sort of therapies. And some of these hypnosis techniques, the recovered memory techniques, but also a lot of the techniques around dissociative identity disorder and multiple personalities all fit in that category of really of both valid in some instances, but also highly suspected by professionals and others. And really quickly, someone asked, was dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities a part of your therapeutic experiences, either with Rex Coker-Hans or Ruth Killpack?
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
They also did not encourage me to go on any antipsychotic medication or to be hospitalized. Unfortunately, woman, the movie was made on...
Sally Fields.
Yeah, Sally Fields was in the movie about...
late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, I mean, that was really a popular movie and gave people some ideas about how dissociative identity diagnosis, what that's about, or multiple personalities. And a book has been written explaining about the actual person that story was based on. She was a Seventh-day Adventist, and about the abusive therapeutic relationship she had with her therapist. I highly recommend that.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing, that it's known within the field of psychology that this phenomenon can be of sort of a clinical diagnosis becoming popular. So whether it's childhood bipolar disorder or ADHD or again, multiple personality disorders, you can sort of see this history of diagnoses over time, over decades, where you'll have kind of slowly increasing or flat levels of diagnosis, but then there'll be some Hollywood movie or some scandal or some report or some popular story of a particular diagnosis. And all of a sudden you'll see this massive spike in diagnoses until it's sort of recognized, whoa, we went overboard. We had way too many diagnoses. We were passing out diagnoses like candy, just like they're doing with opiates, now. And we got to rein this back in because we're way over diagnosing people.
Yeah.
at the drop of a hat. So this is just another dynamic that affects mental health.
Yeah. And when it came to repressed memories, Roseanne Barr in particular
That's right.
was one who was very outspoken, saying that she had memories from 6 months old of being sexually abused, repressed memories that she uncovered from 6 months old. And we know that there's childhood amnesia and that children can't go back to 6 months. And from what I understand, Roseanne Barr has now stepped back. And she said that when she had said those things, that was a difficult time in her life. And she's not advocating for repressed memories.
And oddly, she has ties to Utah because she was raised in Utah.
That's right.
So who knows if she had a recovered memory therapist in Utah
Yeah,
or
that's
from
interesting.
Utah
Might be.
that was influencing her. But okay, so you gave up the business of being an advocate against recovered memory and for false memory syndrome.
That's right.
Because it was just kind of too traumatic for you.
Yeah. No, like breakup or anything, but I just told them, and they honored that. I told them that don't send anyone more my way. I've had enough. And they honored that and treated me with respect.
Because it's brutal. And again, I know that there are going to be really strong SRA advocates that are going to be really mad at me and find ways to sort of say, John didn't treat this perfectly, or John was dismissive, or John stacked the deck by the way he contextualized this, or who he chose to interview in what order. And I kind of entered this knowing that I'm going to get attacked for that. I've tried as hard as I could to be responsible, to show all sides, to give disclaimers out the wazoo. And I'm very eager and excited to find people I can interview who can provide alternative perspectives. But part of this business of applying skepticism in these very sensitive cases is that you're gonna be demonized by one side or the other, or both, for trying to look at this objectively and fairly.
Yeah, based on my conversations with you before we did this, I took note that you
were investigating. You were interrogating me. You were totally investigating.
I was.
And what were you looking for?
I was looking for an open mind. I was looking for whether or not you had an agenda, one way or the other.
Right.
Because I am concerned about reality, and as I've said a number of times already, I in no way want to say that sexual abuse and incest do not happen and that it's not rare.
It happens every day.
I know that it is not rare. And I listed my own sexual abuse history, not related to any repressed memories, and I in no way want to discourage anyone from seeking therapy
or justice, right?
Or if someone has that sense of authentication, if they have that sense of that their memories are authentic, that's only their business as far as I'm concerned.